Welcome, thanks for coming to the first History Cafe of 2023, which is Why America Was Not in Carlos Bulosan's Heart. My name is Sora, I'm the Public Program Specialist here at MOHAI. For those who are low or no vision audience members, I'm a mixed white and East Asian person with shoulder-length brown hair, blue shirt, and tan pants. And we're so happy to present History Cafe in partnership with our lovely partners at HistoryLink, and it will be on the third Wednesday of every month. So, yeah. And then a brief schedule of events. We'll start with a presentation for around 40 minutes, followed by an audience question and answer, and then a book signing. So please do go check out our bookstore at the end to purchase the book. And tonight, we'll be learning about labor, migration, and anti-colonial movements. So to kind of set the stage for that, it's important to acknowledge that here at MOHAI, we're on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place, but today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. Wherever you live on Turtle Island, I encourage you to learn more about whose land you're on, and learn more about the people. So, tonight's speaker is Professor Moon-Ho Jung, Chair of the UW Bridges Center for Labor Studies, and author of Menace to Empire, Anticolonial Solidarities and the Transpacific Origins of the U.S. Security State. We're in for a great talk tonight, so without further ado.
All right, thank you, Sora, for organizing tonight's talk, and thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? If I get too loud, you let me know, okay, because my voice kind of protects. All right, can I give you a one-word answer to the implied question in my talk, which is, why was America not in Carlos Bulosan's heart? You know what that one word is? Andrew does. Empire. Okay? Just think about that. Empire. I'm going to take off my glasses, not because I think I look better without my glasses, but because I need bifocals, and I resisted getting bifocals the last time I got my glasses. I really wish I had gotten bifocals. All right. So when the FBI marked Carlos Bulosan, whose photograph is up on the slide right now, the Seattle-based Filipino writer and activist, as a target of investigation in 1950, the Seattle office of the FBI was interested in his labor organizing and his leftist affiliations locally. But the FBI became really alarmed when its agents discovered that he had ties to the communist movement in the Philippines. A Seattle agent informed J. Edgar Hoover that Bulosan might have been working with Luis Taruk. Pictured here reading the newspaper, and somebody pointed out to me recently that he is wearing Chuck Taylors. I have no idea why, I don't know what the significance is. But the Seattle FBI agent informed Hoover that Bulosan might have been working with Taruk, whom he described as the leader of the Communist Party in the Philippines. Islands. The FBI office in Seattle claimed to have information to suggest a communist revolution was about to erupt in the Philippines in 1951, and not only that, Bulosan had plans to dispatch local Filipino labor leaders from Seattle to the Philippines to join that revolution. In the meantime, the FBI office in San Francisco pored over its files to figure out when the earliest references to Bulosan occurred in their files. An agent there reported that the earliest reference was from 1943 in a report on, quote, suspected members of the Sacdalista, a Filipino labor organization then believed to be pro-Japanese during World War II. So an investigation into Bulosan's labor organizing in Seattle quickly became a matter of a potential revolution in the Philippines across the Pacific. So in my talk today, and I'll definitely go back to Bulosan, okay, but I want to trace the Trans-Pacific roots behind Bulosan's radicalism and the U.S. government's anti-radicalism. That the FBI saw connections between Bulosan's labor activism in Seattle, supposedly pro-Japanese views, and his ties to labor and communist movements in the Philippines, and that all of those activities constituted threats to U.S. national security made sense. It makes sense within Trans-Pacific context. For decades after the Philippine-American War, the U.S. states repeated articulation and narration of threats posed by radical anti-colonial movements created new conditions of possibility for the U.S. state, for the U.S. government. During Bulosan's lifetime, and long before and long after, the U.S. government cast anyone and everyone challenging U.S. imperial claims to sovereignty as seditious enemy of the U.S. government. That is the logic, that is the legacy that Bulosan inherited in his struggles to advance democracy and racial justice across the Pacific, and in his confrontation with a state driven to repress anyone who dared to imagine a world beyond the bounds of the U.S. empire. About a decade before Bulosan's birth, President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed a formal end to the Philippine-American War on July 4th, 1902. But developments on the ground belied U.S. claims to victory and sovereignty. A month earlier, a massive wave of labor strikes had rocked the Philippines. Although the strikes were largely uncoordinated walkouts by aggrieved workers in different industries, there was no question. There was no question that the formation of the very first Filipino Labor Federation had ignited the spark. The Democratic Union of Workers, or the UOD, immediately attracted masses of workers by the summer of 1902. And the idea of organizing Filipino workers was the brainchild of this man right here, Isabelo de los Reyes, the UOD's founding president and a prominent figure on the Philippine left. De los Reyes had been a respected newspaper editor and owner in 1897 when his criticisms of Spanish imperial rule led to his arrest and deportation to Barcelona. His incarceration in a prison notorious for its torture chambers opened de los Reyes' eyes to new radical possibilities. It was in that prison in Barcelona that he learned about anarchism from fellow political prisoners. Anarchism, he said later, was about, quote, the abolition of boundaries with all of us associating together without any need of fraudulent laws or ordinances, which trap the unfortunate but leave the real criminals untouched. After his release in 1898, de los Reyes began publishing a newspaper in Spain titled The Philippines Before Europe during the Philippine-American War with the motto, against North America, no. Against imperialism, yes, until death. In 1901, De Los Rios decided to return to the Philippines to put his lessons on anarchism into practice. And U.S. officials in the Philippines struck back. From the moment De Los Rios returned home, they tried to stifle his political activities. They forbade him to publish a newspaper. They forbade him to organize a political party. And he was immediately criminalized as seditious. Made possible by a law, the Sedition Act of 1901, passed by the U.S. colonial regime in the Philippines. The Sedition Act of 1901 prohibited, quote, any person to advocate orally or by writing or printing or by like methods the independence of the Philippine Islands or their separation from the United States, either by peaceful or forcible means. I mean, that is a significant law. Okay, so to utter anti-colonial thoughts made you a criminal in the Philippines. And it made you a seditious enemy of the U.S. government. And once the labor strikes began in 1902, De Los Rios was deemed seditious and arrested and sentenced to 4 months in prison. Now, he was eventually pardoned by the Governor General, William Howard Taft, but when he was pardoned, Taft went on to say in 1903 that De Los Rios was, quote, a born agitator, entirely irresponsible, who has striven to subvert this government. For years to come, the U.S. colonial regime in the Philippines monitored the movements and activities of anti-colonial Filipino radicals like De Los Rios, casting them as seditious and revolutionary, which in the eyes of U.S. officials were the one and the same. If you were revolutionary, you were seditious. If you were seditious, you were revolutionary. The suppression of the UOD hardly spelled the end of U.S. imperial insecurities. And here's a map of colonized Asia around 1910. And in the wake of Japan's triumph in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, anti-colonial activists across colonized Asia looked to Japan as a source of inspiration. In the Philippines, the specter of Japanese intervention, Japanese assistance in the independence movement against the United States sparked hopes for a new stage of the Philippine Revolution. And no one exemplified the persistence of the Filipino revolutionary spirit and its potential alliance with Japan more than Artemio Ricarte. Ricarte had taken up arms against the Spanish Empire in 1896 during the Philippine Revolution. Growing wary of U.S. designs in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, Ricarte would soon take up arms against the U.S. Empire. U.S. forces captured Ricarte in the summer of 1900. And when he was captured, the U.S. government officials demanded that he pledge allegiance to the Stars and Stripes. He flat out refused, for which he was deported to Guam, another former Spanish colony now claimed by the U.S. Empire. In 1903, when he was taken back to the Philippines from Guam, Ricarte again refused to pledge his loyalty to the United States, and U.S. authorities banished him to Hong Kong, a British colony, where he continued to organize for Philippine independence. Soon, Ricarte began arguing that an imminent war between Japan and Russia, this was before the actual eruption of war, that an imminent war between Japan and Russia might produce political conditions favorable to a revolution in the Philippines. And toward the end of 1903, Ricarte returned to the Philippines in secret and began taunting those who had allied with the United States, those who had spoken out in favor of allying with the U.S. empire. And when he returned to the Philippines in secret, he wrote in Manila's newspapers, "Where is the boasted right of assembly, the freedom of the press, and the liberty of speech?" The Philippine Constabulary, a civilian police force established by the U.S. colonial regime in 1901, fixated on apprehending Ricarte. The constabulary, led by U.S. Army officers and manned on the ground by Filipino recruits, was leading the so-called pacification campaign, or counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And the constabulary grew especially alarmed in 1907 because Ricarte's activities appeared to be part of a wider conflict between the Japanese Empire and the U.S. Empire. Now, although Japan and the United States had reached a high-level diplomatic agreement to respect each other's colonial claims, in 1905, that is U.S. claims over the Philippines and Japan's claims over Korea, that agreement hardly relieved the U.S. state's growing alarm, growing fear over Japan's imperial ambitions. President Theodore Roosevelt said that Japan was, quote, a great civilized power of a formidable type, but with motives and ways of thought which are not quite those of the powers of our race. During the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt pondered Japan's racial motivations. He wrote in a private letter, quote, "I have no doubt that they include all white men as being people who as a whole they dislike and whose past arrogance they resent, and doubtless they believe their own yellow civilization to be better. Japan is an Oriental nation, and the individual standard of truthfulness in Japan is low." So to Roosevelt, Japan loomed large as a civilized and an Oriental threat to white supremacy. And as racial tensions between the United States and Japan mounted in 1906 and 1907, in part over San Francisco's decision to segregate Japanese students into the so-called Oriental school, many American newspapers began forecasting an imminent war between Japan and the United States. Okay, this is 1906 and 1907. The Roosevelt administration, the Theodore Roosevelt administration, for its part, prepared its very first Trans-Pacific War plan on how U.S. forces would fight Japan in that context. News of an impending war between Japan and the United States took on a revolutionary character in and through the Philippines. Almost immediately upon the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War, Filipinos struggling for independence began sharing stories of a war between the United States and Japan, of a war in East Asia that might provide an opening for a new revolution against the U.S. empire. By the beginning of 1907, the growing resentment against U.S. colonial rule and rising hope in Japan's assistance had become bound together, at least in the minds of U.S. officials. A constabulary official wrote to the U.S. ambassador in Japan, superficially, everything is in a fairly quiet condition, but there is a very strong and nasty undercurrent. The people all over the Philippines are convinced that there will soon be war with Japan, and wild-eyed rumors of all kinds are flying about as to its effect upon this country. As Filipino radicals became infatuated with the possibility of working with Japan, U.S. military and constabulary officers came to fixate on what they increasingly saw as a growing pan-Asian threat to the U.S. empire. Harry Bandolz, pictured here, the head of the constabulary, admitted, quote, at heart, all of the Filipinos desire their independence. But he refused to believe that that desire for liberation explained the surge in anti-American activities. Bandolz blamed Japan instead, and its nefarious designs to take over the Philippines, he claimed. And the U.S. military produced and consolidated these suspicions into reports that constructed a racial narrative of U.S. national security that was U.S. imperial security. So in November of 1907, the Military Intelligence Division, or the MID, authored one of the earliest global surveys of U.S. national security threats. And it really dwelled on threats supposedly posed by Asians and Japan in particular. Completely disregarding Filipino grievances against U.S. colonial rule, and the U.S. would rule over the Philippines directly until 1946. That report from 1907 focused on Japan's supposed racial and imperial ambitions. The report stated, quote, Japan has for many years desired to unite the people of Asia with herself as the dominant and controlling power. She believes that she has a heaven-sent mission to control the affairs of the extreme Orient, and all her efforts have been directed to this end for a very long time back. Even as U.S. officials projected and concentrated on Japan's growing influence, it was Filipinos organizing, mobilizing against the U.S. empire that provided supposed evidence of that influence. Now, in reality, many anti-colonial revolutionaries in Asia and around the world, including black revolutionaries in the United States, really did take inspiration from Japan, and they often romanticized Japan as a role model against the West. A revolutionary newspaper in the Philippines argued in 1908, quote, Filipinos, we do not want Japan as a ruler. Nevertheless, we want her as a leader, as a redeemer, as a guide, as breath to the existence of the nations of the Orient and of a people gathered under the same name and united by ties of fraternity and of blood, more or less strong. So rather than listening to Filipinos' desires and demands for independence, U.S. officials looked for signs of imperial Japan at work. Bandolz was sure of it. He responded to that specific editorial by commenting, quote, I have no proof, but I am convinced that the Japanese government owns, or at least controls, that paper. As the anti-colonial movement gained momentum, U.S. authorities kept a close eye on De los Reyes and other revolutionaries that they deemed anti-American and pro-Japanese. So when De los Reyes left for Japan at the beginning of 1910, ostensibly to get the Bible translated and published, rumors of his collaboration with Japan distressed U.S. officials. De los Reyes was busy in Japan, according to constabulary reports. He was making arrangements for the shipments of arms, money, and revolutionary pamphlets written by Spanish anarchists. If the widespread desire and demand for Philippine independence unnerved U.S. authorities, the specter of anarchism or socialism taking root among the masses deepened their fears. And a constabulary informant related that upon De los Reyes' return from Japan to the Philippines, he was planning to launch a socialist party of the Philippines. And that report concluded, quote, "It is believed, and with good reason, that if such a socialist party is formed, it will be truly formidable. Socialistic ideas are rooted here in popular sentiment." For the U.S. colonial security state struggles for independence or sedition, revolution or anarchism and socialism, and Japanese alliance or Pan-Asian solidarity came to be interpreted as one and the same. To support one was to support the other, and all of those alliances and activities demanded more agents, more resources. And that was the racial logic of empire and national security that I would say lives on to today. De los Reyes, for his part, saw through the bloody mess that marked the beginnings of the U.S. national security state as we know it today. When he returned to the Philippines in the fall of 1910, De los Reyes began meeting with those he had worked with in the formation of the UOD. At one particular meeting closely monitored by the constabulary, De los Reyes said, quote, reportedly, quote, "Up to the present, the agents of the government have accomplished nothing in their investigations. They hear noises but do not know where they come from. I myself, whom the Americans consider an irresponsible man, incapable of this kind of work, am constantly playing tricks on them. And when they talk with me, they get nothing out of me, while I, with my insidious and seemingly innocent questions, learn from them whatever I choose." De los Reyes, when he said this, he knew that he was being monitored, that his remarks were being recorded, and he wanted U.S. officials to know that he was not scared, that he was not going to be intimidated. Recalling his lessons on anarchism, he called on Filipino workers to rise up. He reportedly said, quote, "Until the laborers keep their strikes up to the end, following the proceedings of educated workers and responsible socialists, nothing good can come to them. Until the first bomb has been exploded, they will not think of listening to the poor. Until they make themselves feared through violence, they will be considered as ridiculous beings and peaceful lunatics." If anything, De los Reyes was engaging the U.S. security state by mocking its futility and insecurity. Later, a constabulary agent followed De los Reyes to a newspaper office and recorded what happened. The agent reported, quote, "An associate entered and said, 'Hello, Japanese,' at which they all burst out laughing." The vast Japanese conspiracy was on one level, one big joke on Uncle Sam. In the meantime, U.S. authorities also watched Ricarte's activities. Ricarte finally won his release in 1910. U.S. officials promptly took him to the Manila Custom House and ordered him to again pledge allegiance to the United States. He refused, and they placed him on a ship bound for Hong Kong afterward. And the head of the constabulary's information division became convinced that Ricarte would ultimately go to Japan, arguing, quote, "There is no doubt that united with the elements already in Japan and Hong Kong and with those who will join them, they will form a nucleus which will engage in arousing the minds of people here and in pushing them toward a revolution." Ricarte, for his part, had begun looking more and more toward a potential alliance with Japan. He wrote in a letter, quote, "I esteem the Japanese as friends or allies, but as dominators, never. Japan, by her admirable victories over Russia, is the first Oriental nation which has dignified the Orientals," unquote. In the context of rising tensions between the United States and Japan, he argued that Filipinos had only one option, and that was to, quote, "take advantage of that situation to shake off once and forever the hateful American yoke." Tracking Ricarte's revolutionary movements in turn entrenched the U.S. colonial security state in the Philippines and far beyond. The constabulary sent a secret agent to Hong Kong to keep tabs on Ricarte's political activities. As the U.S. security regime extended its reach to prevent an anti-colonial revolution, its excesses ironically mobilized Filipinos, pushing them to welcome a war between Japan and the United States, and to extol Ricarte and Japan as beacons of freedom. In working-class neighborhoods across Manila, a secret agent reported that the residents, quote, "hoped the Japanese would come at once to root up the abuses of the Americans who disturb even the women who have done nothing but protect our interests." The widespread surveillance of anyone possibly affiliated with Japan and Ricarte generated more surveillance, which simultaneously uncovered and generated new revolutionary schemes. Now, Ricarte's dreams for an independent Philippines led him to imagine what he called the Rizzaline Islands, named after Jose Rizal, a republic to be forged out of the Philippines and Guam together. On Christmas Eve 1914, the constabulary, the MID, and the Manila Police Department confronted and eventually suppressed Ricarte supporters who had begun an ill-fated insurrection in Manila. Fed up with Ricarte's movements and pronouncements, U.S. officials pressured British authorities in Hong Kong to expel Ricarte when World War I broke out. And in the spring of 1915, constabulary agents followed Ricarte to Shanghai and arrested him. And they were going to bring him back to Manila. But Ricarte ran away in Hong Kong. Ricarte's wife, Argueda Esteban, pictured here, who was very much involved in the revolutionary movements against both Spain and then the United States. Esteban secured a passage for the couple to Japan. And the couple lived in exile in Japan for the next 3 decades. And in the last years of his life, Ricarte briefly returned to the spotlight. Soon after Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and the Philippines in December of 1941, Ricarte agreed to return home to the Philippines aboard a Japanese military plane. Ricarte at the time was 75 years old. And when he landed in the Philippines, Ricarte raised the Japanese flag and delivered a speech advising Filipinos to cooperate with their Japanese liberators. And Ricarte worked to justify Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II before passing away in July of 1945. Ricarte never pledged allegiance to the United States. But his tragic ending nonetheless acceded to the racial and colonial order that he spent his lifetime trying to overthrow. In the decades after the Philippine American War, Japan was like the United States in 1898, more a symbol of new possibilities than a revolutionary force. And during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines more than 4 decades later, Japan and the United States changed places, with the United States cast again as a possible means toward anti-colonial liberation. But here's the thing. In the end, the contradiction was never between the United States and Japan. It was between empire and democracy. So in embracing Japan, just as if he had embraced the United States, Ricarte served to advance empire. And democracy had to wait in the Philippines and beyond, then and now. As Filipino workers moved to Hawaii and the incorporated states of the U.S. Empire, otherwise known as the United States of America, right? In the 1910s and 1920s, so did the U.S. security state. Both Filipino workers and agents of the U.S. government carried with them histories and memories of what had preceded them. And wherever the Japanese and Filipinos converged, physically, ideologically, symbolically, and otherwise, agents of the U.S. state came to see a pan-Asian conspiracy to undermine and overthrow the U.S. empire. So in 1920, for example, when Japanese and Filipino workers both went out on strike in Hawaii, pictured here, the MID interpreted that strike as something more insidious, something bigger. The MID agent in Hawaii reported, quote, "This may be a case of labor against capital, but it sounds more like a declaration of final racial allegiance. It is a reflection of pan-Asianism." And over time, that agent grew more certain of its racial foundation. He concluded, quote, "The Japanese government is behind this movement." He had no evidence whatsoever. In order to weld together and to whip into line the Oriental population of this territory in the furtherance of its pan-Asian policies. We have, in other words, a powerful potential and masked enemy in our midst. Concentrating on the so-called Japanese problem not only enabled the great expansion of the U.S. security state, but also served to elude or erase the ultimate source behind labor and political struggles in the Philippines and in Hawaii, and that is the U.S. empire. Now, let me start wrapping up by going back to Bulosan. Okay. Through his semi-fictional autobiography, America's in the Heart, published in 1946. How many of you have read that book, America's in the Heart? Okay, all right, that's good. If you haven't read it, check it out. Bulosan attempted to resolve that irreconcilable contradiction between empire and democracy. Toward the end of the book, Bulosan wrote of riding past Filipino migrant workers. And he saw his world collapse in time and space, with memories and dreams somehow crystallizing into an epiphany that gave him a confounding hope in America. He wrote in America's in the Heart, quote, "It was something that grew out of the sacrifices and loneliness of my friends, of my brothers in America, and my family in the Philippines. Something that grew out of our desire to know America and to become a part of her great tradition and to contribute something toward her final fulfillment." That glowing sentiment was a prelude to the last sentence of America's in the Heart that concluded, quote, "I knew that no man could destroy my faith in America that had sprung from all our hopes and aspirations, ever." When I first read that, at the conclusion of America's on the Heart, I wanted to throw that book away. It just, anyway, we can talk more about that if you want. Now, several months into the FBI's investigation of Bulosan's communist affiliations in 1950, the special agent in charge of the Seattle office checked out a copy of America's in the Heart from the Seattle Public Library. I should have bought a copy. I don't know why I checked it out. But he skimmed the book enough to recognize that Bulosan had developed many communist affiliations, okay? Many communist contacts. But the Seattle agent was really struck by the book's last passage, the Ode to America that he quoted at length in his FBI report. Okay? And the agent then wrote, quote, "The Bureau is requested to authorize this office to conduct a discreet interview with the subject, that is Bulosan, for the purpose of determining his attitude in the matter of cooperating with the Bureau." Bulosan, the agent believed, could provide, quote, "exceptionally productive information on Filipino activities." Okay, they want to recruit him as an informant for the FBI. But that was not to be. Bulosan was deemed too dangerous. The FBI became alarmed as its agents learned more and more about Bulosan's anti-colonial and Transpacific connections. And it was no accident that the FBI's very first reference to Bulosan emerged during World War II in an investigation into Sactalista supporters in the United States for their presumably pro-Japanese views. Back in the Philippines, the constabulary had monitored the Sactalista movement in the 1930s for their reputed alliance with Japan and for their reputed ties to the communist movement. The movement that increasingly captivated Bulosan's attention was the communist-inspired and the communist-affiliated Hukbalahap rebellion in the Philippines. On December 1st, 1949, Bulosan wrote a letter to Luis Taruk, the leader of the Huk movement. The letter had been discovered in the possession of the #1 Filipino communist, according to official documents, according to the National Bureau of Investigation in the Philippines. And the Philippines Bureau then forwarded the letter to the FBI. In the letter, Bulosan told Taruk that he was working on a fictional account of Taruk's life and the peasant movement in the Philippines, and that Bulosan hoped to make the novel into a Hollywood film once, quote, "the sudden resurgence of fascist activities here died down." Bulosan knew that the U.S. government was after him, okay, but he longed for a different time, a different place. He wrote to Taruk, quote, "I can't leave the United States now because I will never be able to come back if I do. I think you know the reasons why I will be there someday soon to work with you. I am playing with time." He concluded that letter to Taruk by writing, "I am a very small man, only 5 feet and 2 inches, and I weigh not even 100 pounds. But if there is anything I can do for you and your movement, if it is only the use of my name, please feel free to do so. I am not afraid of the fascist bastards at home." Over Bulosan's lifetime, U.S. colonialism in the Philippines had given birth to a vast security regime, the roots of a national security state driven to suppress sedition and revolution. And on the other side of the Pacific, Bulosan came face to face with that vast security state. In June of 1954, Bulosan requested an interview with the FBI to try to clear his name. In an FBI car parked next to the King Street station in Seattle, Bulosan, who was then employed as the publicity director for the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, the ILWU, Local 37. Bulosan talked to several FBI agents about his personal history. Bulosan explained that he had become interested in the Hukbalahat movement during World War II, he said, quote, because it represented a movement on behalf of the people instead of the rich landowners. Bulosan also related that he had never met Taruk in person, and in fact, he didn't even know that Taruk was a communist. Now, Bulosan denied membership in the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA, and he added that he had tried to read Karl Marx, okay? He tried to read Capital twice, but he said he didn't understand a word of it. When asked by agents, and this is what the report said, how he could claim innocence with regard to following the CP line when by his own books and publications he seldom deviates from that line, the report said, Bulosan shrugged his shoulders and displayed no interest in answering that or any specific question concerning communism. J. Edgar Hoover was not satisfied. He had heard months earlier that Bulosan had boasted of a vast communist communication network linking San Francisco, Honolulu, Saigon, Paris, and elsewhere. In September of 1954, Hoover personally forwarded FBI reports on Bulosan to the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Department of Justice for consideration as to possible deportation. The FBI continued to monitor Bulosan actively through at least May of 1955. In the last years of Bulosan's life, he lived with Josephine Patrick, a self-identified communist, and her young children. And she recalled many years later, quote, he was very beautiful. He was small and delicate, and he had a very soft voice. And he was funny. He had a marvelous sense of humor. In his last days, Bulosan was working on a sequel to America's in the Heart. And he had titled that work provisionally as My Letter to the World, which is very different from America's in the Heart. After passing out drunk in front of the King County Courthouse, Bulosan passed away from pneumonia on September 11, 1956. The FBI took note of his death, but his file remained open. In November of 1959, 3 years after Bulosan's death, a confidential informant told the FBI that Filipino labor leaders who had traveled to the United States the previous summer in 1958 on U.S. government funds, no less, had returned to the Philippines radicalized, adopting the communist ways of thinking to become anti-American. The informant identified Carlos Bulosan specifically as a person in touch with these radicalized Filipino labor leaders while they had toured the United States. So, from his grave in Seattle, Bulosan was apparently radicalizing Filipino labor leaders into seditious subjects. And here's the thing, there was nothing the FBI could do about it except to place that information in Bulosan's FBI. That to me was a fitting coda, a metaphor for the U.S. empire. The U.S. states' claims to security and sovereignty were always greater than its capacity to kill revolutionary struggles for freedom and democracy. In the end, Bulosan had the last laugh. He had a wonderful sense of humor. America was not in his heart because he realized that the idealized American nation he wrote about in America's in the Heart could never be disaggregated from the U.S. empire. That is a political and historical lesson that we should never, ever forget. America was and is the U.S. empire. That was why America was not in Carlos Bulosan. Thank you.
We're going to open it up for some audience questions here. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
I can just stand.
Oh, that's fine. I'll just pass it over to you.
Yeah. Given the magnitude of the effort in the Philippines of trying to mobilize a visible anti-American movement in the early 1900s, all the way up to the 40s, what percentage of the population do you think bought into that argument? Was it a small minority of those, or was it a pretty widespread movement?
In terms of the people involved in the movement, it's hard to say. There was widespread anti-colonial sentiment, that's for sure, right? And the constabulary recognized that, and in letters that Vandal, the head of the constabulary, received, he would write in the margins talking about how widespread that anti-colonial sentiment was. Now, because of that, the widespread nature of that anti-colonial sentiment, right? The U.S. colonial regime quickly figured out that they needed to collaborate with Filipinos, with Filipino leaders, right? So, beginning in the teens, under Woodrow Wilson, and really to 1946, when the United States granted the Philippines independence, the U.S. government cultivated Filipino leaders willing to work with the U.S. government. And I would say that relationship persists to this day, right? So I can't give you numbers, but it's very palpable through these U.S. government documents the level of popular distrust, popular grievances against the U.S. colonial regime, right? And so when U.S. officials, toured the Philippines, they expected a welcome, but throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Filipinos just raised banners to give us our independence, right? And it was all about liberation.
This isn't really a question. This is, it's just really interesting to hear about the history of the early 1900s for somebody who has been more familiar with what happened around World War II and after World War II, and the information about how there was this sort of alliance between the Philippines and Japan is something really unexpected to me.
I do want to emphasize that it was sort of a one-way imagined alliance, because Imperial Japan, the Japanese government, could not have been more anti-radical. Right? It was a colonial regime. And it did not really support these anti-colonial movements. But at the time, I mean, if you read black radicals like Du Bois, they were really infatuated with the possibilities that Japan represented after the Russo-Japanese War. Right? But I think, by the 1930s, when the Japanese government really tried to appropriate that Pan-Asian rhetoric, I don't think it became, or the possibility of Pan-Asianism led by Japan as a radical movement, that ceased to be a possibility. So by no means am I justifying Japanese colonialism. I'm Korean. But that doesn't justify the U.S. empire, right? By no means. And if I can just riff on what you just said, the way I think this history is important for us to grapple with, right? To get our heads around World War II, right? Because I think in the U.S. context, it's still presented as the good war, right? The war against fascism. But the way I understand World War II is it's an inter-imperial war. It's a war between the Japanese Empire and the U.S. Empire, allied with the British Empire, right? And if you look at it that way, like a lot of things begin to make sense.
I have a question after you. The U.S.
Oh, sorry, the mic's off, sorry.
Yeah, so
It takes a second. It'll work. It's on.
it's testing. Okay. So the U.S. gave the Philippines independence, I think, with the tiny McDuffie Act in 19. No.
It promised independence.
But 10 years later, they did grant Philippine independence.
46.
Yeah. Okay.
July
And
4th.
so- okay.
July
and so-
4th again.
So, what prompted the U.S. government to pursue that path, giving Philippines the independence, when, by the same token, then maybe they want to maintain their empire in the Pacific?
I mean, here's the thing, and I think it's true for Japan and the United States throughout the 1930s, and then probably farther back, especially for the U.S. empire, is that the U.S. empire always wants to present itself as anti-colonial, right? So it's an anti-colonial empire, supposedly, right? So how does it justify the U.S. empire in the Philippines? Well, it's supposedly fighting against the Japanese empire, right? And really, you can see the roots of what happens in the Philippines, right? The Philippine independence. You can see that earlier through the Chinese-McDuffie Act in part, right? But even before that, Manchukuo, right? Set up by the Japanese government in Manchuria. So I think both the U.S. empire and the Japanese empire give nods to independence, right? To make these supposedly post-colonial nation states serve their empire or their imperial interests on the guise of independence, right? Was there reparations? No. Can you have true independence without reparations without an apology? I don't think so. So we can talk about formal independence, and I'm not saying that was insignificant. Don't get me wrong, right? But at the same time, there was a larger history, a broader logic behind the granting of that independence in 1936. Does that make sense?
Hello? Yeah, so maybe following that one too. My understanding, and this is Takaki, his interpretation of this stuff, is that part of it is they grant the Philippines independence was explicitly to deny citizenship to Filipinos and associated rights in the United States. Am I wrong in that? Because my understanding was that there was a fight to get rights for Filipinos that had migrated to the U.S. and because they were essentially a colony, defining them became an issue, and so they grant sovereignty to the Philippines so that they cannot be citizens of the United States and therefore cannot be afforded the rights of citizenship.
I mean, that's partly right. I think you're confusing the dates, though.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about the Tidings-McDuffie Act that promised future independence. Okay. Later, but immediately, Filipinos were deemed aliens, no longer nationals, right? Not only aliens, but aliens ineligible to citizenship, right? But that's 1934, Tidings-McDuffie, not independence.
One more question.
Yeah.
So you talked about Filipinos embracing the idea of a Japanese empire in essence as like an opposition to U.S. empire, and it's interesting because a lot of Korean migrants in the U.S. sort of embraced the U.S. as an opposition to Japanese empire in the Korean Peninsula, and through this sort of circuit of communism, anarchism that you're talking about, I'm curious if there's any overlap between those sort of factions where there's these seeming embrace of two different empires.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not all Koreans in the United States, right, supported the party line espoused by Syngman Rhee, who would eventually become, the president of the Republic of Korea, set up by the U.S. empire. There were leftists, leftist Koreans in the United States, deeply critical of the United States at the same time, right? And there was also a very vibrant communist movement involving Koreans not allied with the U.S. government, right? That really was part of a worldwide movement, right? Against colonialism, against racism. And part of what I write about is to get us to remember what the communist movement represented, especially in the 1920s and early part of the 1930s, right? And I'm not trying to romanticize that particular movement or moment, but go back and look at the documents produced by the Third International. They are amazing, right? And they are grappling with colonialism, seriously. Not like Woodrow Wilson, but like they want to contend with colonialism. They figured out that colonialism is at the root of global problems around the world, right? And so Ho Chi Minh, right? Ho Chi Minh, kind of like what Bulosan told the FBI. He said that, I tried to read Marx, I fell asleep. But when I read Lenin in the 1920s, I started to cry because he was a political leader who understood what colonialism meant to colonize subjects around the world. And they were willing to do something about it. And so, yeah, there were some Koreans in the United States appealing for support from the U.S. government against the Japanese Empire. There's no question about that, right? And I think they were being strategic, right? But also, you know, we can't restrict the anti-colonial movement organized by Koreans to sing my movement.
Okay, one last question, and we'll get to the book signing.
In Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart, so in the one that was unpublished at the time of his death, did he become more radical, or do you see America is in the Heart as sort of a critique of white supremacy using the language of democracy? Like, is he making that kind of argument, or did his views legitimately change?
I mean, we can try to unpack America's in the Heart, because I think you can have a radical reading of America's in the Heart. You just have to try to look for irony in that text, I think. And if you do, you can, because it is a very Marxist text if you think about it, right? On one level. But that conclusion is really, yeah, it's hard to take. Because but I think that radicalism is different, right? And what struck me about rereading America's in the Heart in writing this book is when he starts writing about World War II, right? He's not jingoistic. He's not, like, he sees it as a moment to mourn, right? He's thinking about Filipinos, you know, what's going to happen to my family back in the Philippines, right? And what's going to happen to all these kids in the United States. And even as his brother and other Filipinos enlist, right, and they insist on being included in the U.S. military, they enlist and go to war, but they're not, like, they're not driven by this militaristic fervor, right? They're actually really sad at that particular moment, right? Because all that they had worked for throughout the 1930s, they saw it as coming to an end, right? Through that. So that was striking, right? Because I don't remember that part because I was so pissed off, but, you know, by the conclusion. So I think we can read America's in the Heart in different ways. But definitely, if you read the FBI file next to America's in the Heart, you can begin to see that Bulosan had an anti-colonial politics that were always there, right? And you can definitely see it in the ILW yearbooks that he put together. I mean, those are amazing documents. They're available online.
Yeah. Just to add, if you read, he wrote a piece called Freedom from Want, and that's a very socialist perspective in terms of what people deserve as human beings. But I just want to thank you for your presentation, because as a student of Philippine history, we usually just talk about the turn of the century in relationship to Spanish colonialism and U.S. empire. The issue of Japan, in my Asian American studies and Philippine history, we don't talk about what you just laid out, as well as the beginnings of the national security state and its implications on revolutionaries and radicals and activists who are taking up not only international solidarity but struggles in the Philippines. So, you know, we usually think it started in during World War II, when the bases were firmly established in the Philippines, but it stretches all the way back to that whole struggle at the turn of the century. So I really appreciate your perspective and the information that I learned tonight. So thanks.
Well, thank you. No, that radical tradition is deep, that anti-colonial tradition, and it lives on, definitely.
Thank you everyone for your great questions, great comments, and thank you Professor Moon-Ho Jung for a really great presentation. Before we get to the signing, I also want to thank our partners at HistoryLink. And if you want to help us continue creating great adult history education opportunities, and more importantly, if you want to enter a raffle, please consider filling out our survey. And join us on February 15th for our next History Cafe, which will be, let me get the title here, paying tribute to Seattle's Black landmarks and their namesakes, which will be with historian and author Mary Henry. So we hope to see you back. Thank you all for coming. Purchase the book, get it signed.